mothers and fathers never went to visit Flanders. They couldn't see it, but they didn't actually know what had happened. When I think about it, because I don't have any relatives in Flanders, I actually think of this beautiful boy, Roland Hill. He comes from Southwell, Salem in the Eastern Cape, and I found this photograph in the little church, and his parents had obviously, or his father had obviously put it there, and the top of it says, fell in Flanders 1917. And that's all that remains of Roland. And I also think of Alan Eric Purden. He was twice orphaned, and there is no photograph that I have been able to find. All that actually remains of Alan is his 15-year-old signature on his attestation form. That's all there is. And I did manage to track down an old lady once, and she said to me, oh, he was the adopted one. So there was one person who had heard of him. But anyway, let us go on to 1917. We learn from this particular battle, the Battle of Passchendaele, firstly, that by this time the British Army had sufficient material and it had expertise. And it had both those in sufficient quantities that it could have conducted successful offensive operations on the Western Front. The second thing we know is that the military, that the leadership, both military and politically, absolutely failed to capitalize upon the developments in artillery, in skills, in planning, and in strategy. And thirdly, we'll learn that military operations were frequently implemented for political developments rather than for military reasons. Now, the learning curve did not apply to our friend General Douglas Haig. It did not apply to the British High Command. During 16 and 17, the British High Command had failed to grasp the potential of that very limited idea that I talked about last year of bite and hold. Just go a little bit and hold on to it. Go a little bit and hold on to it. Instead, Haig always had the idea of a vast plan and unlimited objective. There were these unrelenting succession of little small-scale attacks, but they were always planned as we are going to have a very big decisive blow. It's going to totally overwhelm the enemy's defensive system. We will unleash the cavalry a la warhorse, and we will win the war. And so Haig's command and commanders continued with the idea of grand designs instead of bite and hold. And unfortunately, the British government was also not very interested in what was going on. They didn't want limited success. Lloyd George really didn't take them into account. He wanted two things. He wanted a sudden smashing victory, and he wanted three things. He wanted to be carried out by non-British troops, and he wanted to be carried out on a battlefield far distant from the Western Front, against the Turks or the Eastern Front or Palestine. Somewhere else, anywhere else but close to home. But nevertheless, he and his cabinet sanctioned Passchendaele, and they allowed at least 200,000 men to be killed. Now, here is the conundrum. You've got battle going on in France and Belgium for all of the last 3 years, and what has emerged is the difficulty of having a successful offensive. Although you're dug in behind, or the Germans are dug in behind a series of trenches and protective barbed wire with a lot of guns behind them and large quantities of artillery, each side, although they are dug in, remained intent on victory, and they obviously couldn't work out anything except continuous attacks. Now, the problem with continuous attacks is that you've got your trenches. The trenches are constructed in such a way that you can't, no offensive can come through you, but you yourself also want to breach the enemy's trenches and hoping that you'll break out into the open. And why couldn't it happen? Well, there was something called the machine gun. Now, this is a posed picture, but it gives you a pretty good idea that you wouldn't go on to go up against a machine gun at a trench. There were also vast artillery guns. And so the developments in military technology had increased two things: the depth of the killing ground It was miles and miles that the artillery could control, and it had increased the volume of fire that defenders could fire. So that intermediate area between the trench lines, no man's land, really nobody particularly wanted to cross it. Now, this meant that attacking troops were in peril for a far longer time. You've got the bolt-action magazine-fed rifle, you've got the machine gun, you've got breech-loaded artillery, you've got elongated shells that now deliver shrapnel, and you've got high explosives. And forces advancing across open ground were pretty well doomed to failure. And of course, when you've done that, this is actually a photograph of German barbed wire. That's what you meet up with. You've crossed no man's land and you're going to be stuck on the barbed wire. And of course, behind the barbed wire, these are some Brits. The defenders may be below ground, it may be dreadful to live in trenches, it may be very squalid, life is precarious, but the balance of the advantage lay with the defenders. Well, it was really only artillery that was the weapon which was now going to play a principal role in this part of the war, in clearing the way. Heavy artillery to put the enemy's guns out of action, field artillery to neutralize barbed wire, machine guns, and advancing troops. And this is not easy. This is actually a Canadian gun pit. And as you can see, it's actually pretty well concealed if you are advancing from over there, and if your artillery is somewhere over there, and if your aeroplane is trying to fly up here looking for the gun pit. It's not that easy to find. So it isn't a simple task to put the other side's artillery out of action. And you know, aeroplanes were not great. They could not always go up in the air if the weather was bad. They could not always spot the fall of the shells so as to direct their own guns as to where to go and knock out the other side's artillery. Often your photographs were pretty hopeless when you brought them back to ground, but bad weather, the number of planes, other fighter aircraft actually meant that fighter aircraft or reconnaissance planes or observation didn't always work. So a successful offensive on a large scale was dicey, difficult, and it had not been successful in 1916 and it was not successful in early 1917. So the war could only be won by an offensive, and yet the advantage lay with defenders. Now, there were a couple of things. For instance, gas. You could use gas as a weapon to help you through. The trouble is, if the wind went in the wrong direction, that was a little bit sad for you. And then, as we know, there was the tank, but I'm not showing you a picture because they could not use tanks in Flanders because of the mud. So we've got offensive operations which are pretty well doomed unless supported by a large quantity of artillery ammunition. And as there is more ammunition, as the gunners become more expertise, the balance starts to shift. The attackers, the offensive, starts to get a bit of an advantage, and the defensive is struggling a little bit. But here is where the decision-making should have been made in the war cabinet. The civilian leaders are meant to decide things, but they actually decided nothing. And you'll see later, our own Jan Smuts, for some reason, was in the war cabinet instead of staying with his men in East Africa. And he did make a good contribution as regards his assessment of the RFC, but the rest was pretty hopeless. Lloyd George, as I've said, was head of the coalition government, and he hated General Haig. He did not think that Haig was fit to direct operations. He much preferred the French commanders, and this was very obvious and apparent throughout the war. 1917, General Joffre is booted out, and General Nivelle is brought in. And he has a lot of wonderful plans, and everybody is absolutely overwhelmed by his charisma. Alas, he launched a great strike, and the French army mutinied. So many of them were killed. So 1917 was a very, very precarious time, because now General Pétain is brought in, but under Nivelle, you've got the French army mutinying, and that's a whole section of line that is now very, very vulnerable. So the pressure is on the British army to keep the Germans busy. So we have the front line, which you know. Here is the Channel. We've got Germany, we've got Brussels, and we've got Paris. And here is the front line wiggling all the way down to Switzerland. And where we are interested in is where the South Africans are serving with the British Expeditionary Force. April 1917, we have the Battle of Arras. The only successful operation was actually the Canadians at Vimy, okay? And they are there. But then they were stuck. They didn't move any further. Haig was very obsessed with doing something here in Flanders, but nobody else was actually very interested. And Lloyd George listened to the French, and the French said, we need to have the British do something here because we are really struggling over there. And so Haig was always sent to do something elsewhere than where he really wanted to be. This is the War Policy Committee, a little subcommittee of Cabinet. We've got the Prime Minister Lloyd George. We've got Lord Milner, well known to us from South Africa, who was Secretary of State for War. We've got Lord Curzon, who is the leader of the House of Lords. And we have the Minister of Defence from the Union of South Africa. Now, they decided what was going to happen. But they actually didn't really bother. They met very, very seldom, and when they did, they discussed everything else. So now this is the Third Battle of Ypres and Flanders. Again, we've got the Channel. Now, here more or less is the front line, and as you can see, Bruges, and that is the border with France. And it is only between here and there, that part of Belgium, that is not occupied by the Germans. One forgets, and I've been reading quite a lot about life under the occupation in northern France and in Belgium. Most of a significant proportion of Belgium was occupied, and the entire industrial heartland of France was. So now there is this tiny little bit of Belgium, very, very flat. And here, the Belgians are here, and what they actually did incredibly cleverly, they flooded it. And the Germans couldn't cross. They just opened all the canals, and the land was flooded. But it is here that you have the whole in Flanders fields idea, okay? Centered around Ypres. And if you've heard of the Ypres salient, this is the salient, this wiggle. It was not a good thing to hold on to Ypres, but it became very symbolic. And why? Because the Germans could attack from there, they could attack from there, and they could attack from there. It was surrounded on more or less three sides. Now, this is another map, and the only purpose of really showing you is to say, well, there is Ypres, and this is the high ground of France, and by high ground, you'll see, you barely notice it, but the Germans held the high ground. Now, if you hold the high ground, you can look down on what everybody else is doing. That's the first thing. You can see everything the British are doing. And secondly, all the rain runs downwards. And it is so waterlogged that you actually can't even dig trenches. You have to build up. So the Germans were very well situated around Ypres. Now, what Haig had in mind was the following. Because remember, he only wants to do big things. So his idea is, well, we'll go out from Ypres, we'll come here from Poppering, we'll go along the railway line, we'll march our troops, and we'll get to Ypres, and then we're going to go forward to the high ground where the Germans are, and then I'm just going to move forward, the cavalry is going to come forward, and we're going to go right round to the coast, we're going to land some people at the coast, and we're going to chase all the Germans into Holland. And it's going to be wonderful. And that was the plan. It was a big plan. It was a great plan. But there was some politics going on that made for problems. We know that the Tsar has been overthrown, that the Mensheviks are in power but not for long. Russia is still committed to fighting at this side, at this stage on the side of the Allies, but government is very shaky, and the Germans are free to begin moving their troops from the Eastern Front across to the Western Front. So there are more and more troops on the German side on the front line. We've also got Wilson now having in April declared war on Germany. It's on the side of the Allies. They're going to arrive, but not, unfortunately, now in 1917, only really in 1918, but they're going to come with a lot of enthusiastic troops and a lot of equipment. And Haig wanted the war to be over, and as I said before, he wrote in his diary, "Oh God, let there be victory before the Americans arrive." So what he did was he went to General Plumer, and he said, "General Plumer, I want you to prepare me an offensive." And Plumer said, "Okie doke," and he came up with a plan which was just to capture a couple of ridges. And Haig said, no, I want something bigger and grander. So he went to General Rawlinson. And Rawlinson said, "Yes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a little series of little tiny bite and hold operations." And Haig said, no, I didn't have that in mind. So he went back to Plumer. And Plumer said, "Okay, you really want me to think this through? I'll tell you what, I'll start in the south and do one little attack there, and then I'll do a little attack in the north." And Haig said, "No, I'm really not happy." And he went back to Rawlinson, who said, "Well, I could do a series. We could do something in the south and the north at the same time." Haig was not a happy fellow, so he went off to a conference at Doullens with all his army commanders, and he said to them, "The main effort is now switched to Ypres, quote, with the ultimate objective of securing the Belgian coast and of obtaining other strategical results." So he told them what the victory would be. And then he said, "And I'm going to appoint General Gough because the rest of you have let me down." Now, Sir Hubert Gough was actually rather ill-qualified. He had never commanded a major campaign. He had never done anything on the Ypres salient. But he said, Yabas, he was a devotee, quote unquote, of the harouche, the rapid advance. And he could, said Haig said, Gough is a man who can focus his gaze on distant objectives, meaning he was a man of vision. So now we've got our Battle of Ypres. We have a few problems. Our purpose is very uncertain. Is it going to be a little bit in the south or a little bit in the north or the whole thing? Are we just going to get ridges, or are we going to rush through in the rapid harouche to the coast? The purpose is not clear. The planner has swapped and swapped and swapped, okay? And this meant that the timing kept changing, and the timing made a difference because it depended on when it was raining. Well, in fact, they ignored the rain. But what Haig had in mind was this big campaign that was going all the way through to the coast. Now, facing the Fifth Army was the German defensive system. There was a front line, and the blue ones are all German ones. These are trenches, machine guns, and we've got pillboxes. And you can see they are scattered all over Flanders. So we've got many trench systems. We've got backlines, we've got hundreds of pillboxes, which are low concrete shelters built up several feet, covered in mud and soil. We've got machine gun nests, we've got garrisons sometimes in those pillboxes. And General Ludendorff here sends his expert to redo his defences. So now they bring in a lot of artillery, very well situated. They've got wonderful observation that they can tell their artillery, we're standing on the ridge and we can tell you where to fire left, right, further, more backwards. We've got German soldiers in amazing trenches because they're on the high ground, they're not down on the low ground. And generally, we're pretty awful people. This is obviously staged photograph, but what's quite interesting is the Germans very often used wattle, and there are still some replicas of wattle trenches here. But you can see they're all gung-ho, and they're not covered in mud, and they're ready. This is what they were up against. Now, what were the British looking after, and where were they going? Well, it was the town of Ypres. This was the centre of the salient. Let me just go back. We've got here the North Sea, and Ypres is actually a port. You might know Antwerp is a port. So Ypres is a port because we've got canals coming all the way through. Here is the Acer River, and there is a canal going all the way through to Ypres. Okay? And along that canal would be bought the wool from England. And in Ypres, we have the cloth hall, where the medieval guilds dealt in woven goods. We have a wonderful old cathedral, and we have quite a bourgeois, mercantile, business capital for this part of France, this part of Flanders. Now, this is the area where the South Africans are meant to be attacking. And they're going to come from here to Poppering. They're going to march across through Ypres, and then from Friesenberg, the South Africans are going to go up here. Rulers is on the railway line, and they're actually going to go to a place called Zonneberg. This is the specific map, and you can see it says advance of South African and Scottish troops, because remember, the South Africans were part of the Scottish troop. We were the 9th Scottish Division. So we're going to go, and this, well, in fact, it's easier. Here is the Australians, and that's effectively the line between the brigades. And what is interesting is that these farmhouses and these landmarks are still there today. So the South Africans are starting off from here. You've still got Borrie Farm, you've still got Beckhouse, you've still got Vampier, and they're going through Zevenkot, and this is Zonneberg. And this was the area that the South Africans were in. Truly, this holiday I've just had in October with the friends, I dropped them off here, and it was a case of getting the fractious children exercised every morning. So what I did was I dropped them off, and they walked along this path, and then there's another path through farms here, and I picked them up here at the cemetery, okay? And it probably took them less than an hour. All right, so it's not a vast area. Now, who are the South Africans? Well, this is my dear little Roland. Roland Hill, and he is the son of a very successful farmer. His mother died in childbirth, and he was brought up by Granny Mia. His parents lie buried outside the Salem Church, and he went to school in Southwell at this little school where the Reverend Patterson taught, and where the 2 Patterson boys were killed, one at Delville Wood and one 2 months after. This is the local church where I found that lovely photograph of Roland. And here in 1908 is the photograph of the entire school. So, here is Roland. There is his brother Bernard. And there, holding on to the school dog, is his brother Melville. And here is his auntie Maud, Florence Maud, who's a teacher. So that's the school. And all the boys went off to war, and very few of them came back in one little town just outside in fact, it's not a town, it's a farming community outside Graafstown. So there's Roland, Bernard, Melville, and Maud. All right, Roland joins up. He works on his father's farm, and he joins up he has been in the South African West Campaign, and he goes off in 1916 to fight with the South African Horse in German East Africa. He is in German East Africa, and then we have a medical investigation because he has had malarial fever 15 times, being 4 times in hospital. He's had chronic dysentery, and like most of the South Africans, he was repatriated back home. He was temporarily unfit for war service, and that is in February 1917. Well, obviously, Roland went back to the farm for a very short time with brother Bernard and brother Melville, who'd been sent back. He was discharged with good character, and so what did he do? He immediately attested overseas. Adventure, cash wage, life is a bit boring being the youngest son, even though it's a very successful farm. So Roland goes back to war very quickly. And Roland and Bernard, both of Salem, and somebody else from Grahamstown, have signed on for service overseas. It was called overseas service to go to France. So off he goes. Now, who is the other one? And here we've got Roland signing up. He's about 21 at this stage, and he tells us that he's been in German Southwest Africa and German East Africa. He didn't go alone, he went with Bernard, and this is his cousin Roy, older cousin, and he had, after Delville Wood and Egypt, he'd actually been promoted to being a lieutenant. I think Roy had a nervous breakdown because he was sent back to South Africa after Passchendaele. But after 3 months in South Africa, he went back to France, and that's a story for another day. So, just a little bit away from Salem, we have the little church of Clumber. And in the little church at Clumber, in the Wesleyan church, the Circuit of Bathurst, in 1900, a little boy called Alan Eric was christened. He was the adopted son of Dorcas Purdon, who was then about 50-something. And what was interesting was that Alan was given, she was a widow, and Alan was given the Purdon surname. They are a very large and successful and well-known family. And so he must have somehow or other really been a Purdon for her quite grown-up children to have allowed this little boy to be given the name of Purdon. So Alan Eric was christened and adopted by Dorcas, but alas, when he was 2 years old, Dorcas died. And so Alan was brought up by, this is his sister-in-law Ethel and his brother Hedley. And he was brought up by them, and he was sent to primary school at Clumber, next door to the church, which you can see there. And Alan would have been a very successful person, perhaps, because his brothers were very successful and there were many farms to inherit. And then he went off to Kingswood. They were the kind of people who had money, and off he went to Kingswood. And he wasn't there very long, because by the time Alan was 15, off he went to war in German Southwest Africa. Okay? But I don't know that he saw service in Southwest Africa. I think they kept him back because they realized how young he was. Anyway, that war being over, you can see that's 1st of November 1915. That's the end of the war in German Southwest Africa. And Alan says that he has been done 5 years of cadet training. Well, he couldn't possibly have done 5 years of cadet training at Kingswood. He hadn't been there long enough. He was a big liar. But anyway, at Potchefstroom he lied, and he entered the South African infantry. Now, just to remind you, there's always a description of the soldier, and the reasons are many, but when you put scar on dorsum of left hand and brown birthmark on left thigh, it's so that you can identify the soldier if he can't tell you who he is or if he's dead, okay? But alas, bodies just disappeared, and so there was actually nothing to look for. But when Alan, and I don't actually know what happened for quite a long time, but they discovered after he had enlisted that he was much too young. They did not send him back to South Africa, because that would have been quite expensive and a bit of a nuisance, because they wanted him. So what they did was they transferred him to the Army Reserve, and he was sent to work in the National Bank of South Africa in November of 1916. They kept him in England, waiting for him to be old enough. And here is the National Bank of South Africa, and this is actually the Lord Mayor's parade in London, and wounded South Africans were given a front row ticket to watch the Lord Mayor's parade, and there they are, and Alan is working there. Well, unfortunately, Alan was not pure in heart or body, and you will see that, alas, he was diagnosed with venereal disease. And he was sent off, and he was only 16. He was sent off to Connaught Hospital at Aldershot, and you will remember Constance Hulse was nursing there at the time. And from there, Alan was then taken on strength of the 4th Regiment South African Infantry in the field. In other words, he was urgently needed. There was wastage and they were short of people, and he was sent across, and you can see it is the 21st of July 1917. So we know which company he was with, A Company, 4th Regiment, and he was sent across. Now, Alan, if, as we know from his birth certificate, he was actually only born in 1899, he wasn't actually yet 17. He was still 16 when he was sent across. Now, where did they go? Well, trains or ships brought them. Ships from here, trains from here. And they would have started off in Poppering, where there were a lot of camps for large groups of people. The South Africans arrived there about a month before they went into battle. And there was quite a lot of training going on. So here they were at Poppering. It is on the railway line, and here are a whole lot of Australians arriving. You can see by the hat. Here are people arriving by bus, if the trains don't have people. Here they are marching. And it's basically a little town that was used for gathering and for moving people onwards into battle. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting about Poppering is it's also famous for where Tok H was founded. There was a house called Talbot House. A man called Talbot had been killed. His brother was the Bishop of Pretoria. His other brother was a military chaplain. And so they named this particular house Talbot House, and it became a place where soldiers could go, whether they were officers or whether they were other ranks. A man called Tubby Clayton ran it. And if you go now, whoever is there is obliged to offer a cup of tea. So I have made cups of tea for people as they arrive. And they had games and chess, and they had a piano, and they had libraries, and you had to leave your hat if you borrowed a book. And they had this little garden, and upstairs they had a little chapel. Now, you went from Poppering and you marched through to Ypres. And it got pretty dismal the closer you got to Ypres. And then the rain started. And the rain started a bit early this year in July. There were downpours. And this meant a number of things. Firstly, you couldn't have aeroplanes going up, so they couldn't do observations for artillery. Secondly, you couldn't even try to use tanks in the mud. And your infantry couldn't advance very speedily. And Haig started to say, well, you know, maybe not. Maybe we won't do it now. And Gough, who was into the big harouche, said, no, we'll absolutely carry on. It really doesn't matter what the losses are. And so by early September, Haig then consulted all the army commanders, and they all had different suggestions. Fanshawe of the one particular army said there are no good prospects of success. And Plumer then came back into the picture, and he said, well, why don't we just do a little plan? One of those little buttonhole operations that you hate so much. Why don't we just plan to take about 1,000 to 1,500 yards? And this was now a brand new plan, all of a sudden a week before the battle starts. So we've now got a brand new plan. These are Canadian machine gunners, I might tell you. We've got limited objectives. The breakthrough to the coast is now abandoned, and we've got the same old slog to get this 1,000 yards, about 100 men per yard. Now, the artillery concentration is going to provide the critical ingredient, it's decided. This is going to really wipe out the Germans. And they had a lot. The 5th Army had 300 heavy and 600 field guns. They were up against pillboxes like this, and you'll see some more. They did have balloons going up, and they could do aerial operation, and they began flash spotting. In other words, balloons saying over there, and then the artillery would shoot over there quite early in September. They were up against German artillery that, as I said, was very well situated. They were up against German gas, but they had masks. And you'll be happy to see in the Red Cross, the SPCA will be happy to see, so did the horses. So here we are with Google, and we are going across this lovely flat field land. This is Wilkiestraat, which is where it all sort of happens, okay? And this is Zonnebeek Road. And the South Africans are on this side of Zonnebeek Road. Because it's Google, actually here, where Potasiestraat is, there are actually 4 cemeteries in a row here. I mean, everywhere is cemeteries in this part of the world. We've got aeroplanes on the ground because they can't go up because of the rain. We've got artillery and what are called creeping barrages. We'll fire where there as the infantry go up. Then we'll fire there and the infantry will go up. So we'll just do slowly, 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 slowly. But you have to be very good to do that. You really have to be able to judge, and your infantry has to keep pace with you. And it means the infantry are sheltering behind what's going in front of them, behind the artillery. And so they set off. This is now the night of the 19th of September. It's Alan Purden, it's Rowland Hill, and it is 65,000 other men on this particular night, 18 assault brigades. They go up, they get into position, and at midnight, the rain begins to fall. And the approach march becomes increasingly difficult as the ground is churned up to mud and the shell holes begin to fill with water again. What did they leave behind them? Well, this is what Ypres looked like then. That was the little bit left of the cathedral. And that's what the town looked like, and that's what they marched through. They were marching through this, and as they looked behind, this is what they marched through. This is Menin Gate, because Ypres had the river, the Acer Canal round it, it had walls. It was a moated town. It was a moated Guildhall medieval town. And that's what they saw. Now, as you can see, there are attempts being made to take the artillery up because people had been working hard in those Labour battalions. Shells. Shells. No wonder the ground is so destroyed. And here we've got where the South Africans are. They march up from Ypres in the mud, and they get ready here. And the 2nd Regiment of the South Africans are there, the 1st Regiment there, they're in support, and then the 4th and the 3rd Regiment. So they are mainly here. Okay, they're going to go up. We've got Beckhouse, Borrie Farm, Vampire Farm, Mitchell's. I'm going to show you Bremen Redoubt. Okay, and up here is where their cemetery is. Okay, so that's the border, the right side of the South African Brigade boundary, a very small area. This is Zonnebeek, which was the goal. This is how it looked like before the war, and this is how it looked like as they marched up. That's what was left. The station, and there's the crossroads. Not much left, and you can see somebody's marked, there is Zonnebeek Station, and Bremen is round about here, and you'll see why Bremen is important. Note that Bremen is a little bit of a lump. Okay? And this is what remains of Zonnebeek Station in October 1917, and this is what they're so keen to take. So the South Africans are going to set off, as we know. Now, the Germans, as I say, are in their positions, and we've got farms all marked, and obviously these are not the names that the Belgians have given to their own farms. You know, at one stage there must have been an apple tree. And at one stage, there was a square building, and that's called Grey Ruin. So, you know, people gave the names that suited them at the time. Now, here they are in the so-called trenches, and just have a look at the mud. This is what was described, and I put on Monday on the list, it was thick porridge, said General Plumer. And this actually is the South Africans. These are the South Africans, and that's the South African Scottish. And imagine wearing a kilt, thick with mud. Strangely enough, apparently the kilts were far warmer than the trousers. But they were very thick and they were very heavy, and if you were shot down and you went forward like that, your kilt went forward, and these soldiers did not wear underpants. And so there are stories about we marched and the soldiers fell down, and we marched looking at their buttocks. You know, we had to carry on through them. Alan was in the Scottish. Remember, he was in A Company. Here are South Africans 3 days later in another trench after this particular battle. And these would be ammunition canisters, okay? And you can see they are quite far back and they are elsewhere because it is not muddy. But it's certainly not comfortable or pretty, is it, for people who have been in a terrible battle. But roads needed to be built, and so here are the Australians building some roads. They were called Corduroy Tracks. You can see sometimes they did it like this, just building them in a wrong go, or here they just walked around because this would be for men to walk along. The other bigger one is for artillery to go along. So now our soldiers would have been going wiggle, squiggle, wiggle, squiggle, wiggle, squiggle along these little tiny duckboard tracks. If you fell off and you fell into a shell hole, it was very difficult for your comrades to pull you out because it sucked. It was like quicksand. And there are a lot of stories of people just drowning and people saying, shoot me, shoot me. So here we've got more duckboards being created. Now, because there weren't good roads and because there really weren't any signs and because there weren't any place markings, they put tapes so that people could follow the tapes. Here is a picture stroke photograph of the South Africans setting off. All right, so the South Africans actually set off. And you can see here the pillboxes. That is Bremen Redoubt, and we've got Zonneberg over here. And this is the area they are covering. Now, they were actually very successful. The casualties were high, near both Potsdam farm down here and Bremen. But at the end of the afternoon, of the 20th of September, the South Africans and the Scottish Brigade had taken 1,000 yards. They hadn't quite got to Zonneberg, but they had been quite successful. What had they captured? Well, just to show you some pictures, and obviously this is what they took photographs of. Here are the pillboxes that they were busy capturing, and there are terrible stories about how they managed so to do. Pillboxes with the dead. You don't often, in fact very seldom do you see British photographs of British dead. So there is one here of Australian dead. Here are some Australians. This is an Australian group at a pillbox. Now this is Bremen Redoubt. It's underground, it still exists. It was uncovered about 10 years ago. I, alas, arrived a little bit too late. The brickworks which owns the land closed it up. They decided it wasn't safe for tourists like me. I tried to explain I was special, but they weren't interested. But strangely enough, the water-sogged, soggy nature of the land has meant that a lot of things are preserved. When they find bodies, their leather boots are still intact. And I don't understand, but I think it's got something to do with oxygen not reaching, okay? So anyway, this is Bremen Redoubt. It's a deep, deep trench. Look, they found some shells in it, okay? Some bunks. And this is where the Germans were waiting to come out, okay? And it is still there. This is where they got to. This was the trench at Zonneberg. So they got 1,000 yards on the afternoon of the 20th of September, and this is their great victory and that which they captured. This is an iconic photograph called The Man in Mud, and it just is an indication of what it was all about. Pillboxes, and here is your relative or your loved one in that ground. This is what those people that you hopefully have been thinking about went through. And I don't know how they came back and lived ordinary lives. Now, here too are South African stretcher bearers, and look who they are bringing back. It's rather interesting, and there too is a German soldier. Okay, stretcher bearers from this particular battle, and this, and this, and this. We're now further back. You can see it's dry, and interestingly, you can see we are now able to start making roads, and we've got rubble. The wounded waiting to be taken away. The wounded waiting to be taken off to hospital. The wounded, and again, look who's all sharing a cigarette. The wounded. And then, of course, those who were left behind. And this is, remember I said at Portage Road there are 3 cemeteries. One is Portage Chateau, one is Portage Casualty Clearing Station, and one is just Portage Cemetery. So I don't know which one this is, but it is the origins of the Portage Cemetery. And you can see these are, in about 1919, the kinds of cemeteries they are creating. You might ask why not 1918? Well, in 1918, the Germans had overrun all the land that was captured on this particular day. It was a victory that lasted for a very short period of time. Now, while all this had been going on, War Cabinet had not actually been particularly concerned about what was happening. They discussed, according to the minutes of the War Cabinet meetings, the offensive in Italy. As I read through the minutes, I kept thinking, well, something's going to crop up. Well, they talked about the offensive in Italy. They talked about Austria-Hungary and how long it could last. They talked about how to get rid of Turkey. They said that General Lyndon Bell, whoever he might have been, was far too cautious in the winter campaign in Palestine. There was infirmity of intent in the Passchendaele campaign, but they didn't say how or who or why. And that War Cabinet, none of them seemed to have noticed that this Flanders campaign was their responsibility. Smuts on the 11th of October said, actually, what is the attrition rate? Curzon said, well, we need to know the effect of the offensive on British reserves of manpower. And they demanded statistics, and they got them, and they didn't discuss them. They weren't actually interested in how many people had died for 1,000 yards. Now, just to show you the value of that 1,000 yards, we've got Poppering, we've got Ypres. Now, the front line in November 1914 is this brown one. Is that the brown one? Yes. Okay, so that's where the Germans stop and look nicely situated on the ridge. Okay, then in 1915 they've moved forward a bit, but it's not a great worry to anybody in particular. Now we've just had our big battle, and we have sacrificed a lot of men, and we are now here. We're on the ridge. Great. And a few months later, in April 1918, the Germans are here. So actually, what was it all about? And in 1918, the Germans very, very nearly won the war. So this is actually where the South Africans got to eventually, where the British got to. This is Passchendaele. Passchendaele in the middle of the war, and Passchendaele at November 1917. That was the great victory. That was the ridge. It's actually quite a boring little sort of row of houses on a road. So Lloyd George, remember, hated Haig. He was an absolute critic of Haig, and if he could have sacked him, he would. He actually went to France and he said to every general, would you like to take over the job? And they all said, no thanks. But Lloyd George could not say, we are doing disastrously. He had to keep up morale. He had to pretend they were doing very well. So they said, we can't sack Haig. We'll have to keep him on. He's been a total failure as far as we're concerned. And what we'll do is we'll talk about Italy and Turkey and what we should do there. Now, it was, as I said, a precarious time. We've got the Russians here, and they have now pretty well stopped, because we're now looking at November 1917. The Germans are coming across here, and the Americans are coming. This is a very anxious time. And what have we achieved in this third Battle of Ypres? 275,000 casualties, 70,000 killed. We've lost 10 to 12 divisions out of 60. We got 1,000 yards, but really, what is 1,000 yards if you want to walk from your motor car here today? Yes, the enemy suffered a bit of a loss, and everybody's now feeling a little bit tired of this war. Suddenly, it has really hit home. Where are we going? Is it ever going to end? It was a very scary time. Now, here is a casualty list. It's casualty list number 133, issued from Pretoria. So it's number 133, and it's issued by Defence Headquarters in Pretoria. It's the Union Imperial Service Contingents, Pretoria in October, and they came out every day. And there are many, many categories. There are about 20 categories. There's seriously wounded, badly wounded, mortally wounded, died of wounds afterwards, died of wounds before, died of everything. You know, it's very complicated. So there are not a lot here. So we've got in the heavy artillery, killed in action, wounded, slightly wounded, mildly wounded, and then died. And what we've got, what we've got here under missing, we've got Rowland Hill. That beautiful face is missing. So in the local Tatler of the day, which is called the South African Ladies Pictorial, was published the notice. Mr. George Hill, who has 3 sons fighting in Europe, 1 in German East. His son Roland is amongst the missing. The gallant young fellow has served since the beginning of war in South, West and East Africa, proceeded to Europe, and was in all the fierce fighting last month. And Alan Purdon, well, somebody saw Alan die. So when they had a roll call the day after the battle, when Purdon's name was called out, somebody said, I saw he was shot and he was dead. So he is very specifically killed in action. And it's noted that he's killed on the 22nd of September, but dates are not very good. I've got one chap, Henry Hairbottle McCluig. His father was the headmaster of the local school. And Henry Hairbottle McCluig officially died between the 14th and between the 22nd of July 1916. Nobody actually knows, but somebody saw a body. So Alan is dead, and his service card has him killed in action. So, with Alan dead, the Clumber Church has a memorial service, and in the course of time, they erect a very beautiful, for a very small Wesleyan community, they erect a lovely plaque to the glory of God and in grateful memory of the men of this district who gave their lives in the Great War. Now, I've talked to you about Charles Dugmore, Eric Dold, his brother Donald Dugmore. Les Mandy was last year at Delville Wood, Hubert Openshaw, Norman Purdon we lost at Arras, and we've now lost Alan Purdon, whose name is always spelt differently, okay? And Cameron Purdon is to die next year, okay? We've got the 2 brothers Dixon in East Africa, and we've got Sid Dugmore and Desiree Manoy in East Africa, who I know. I actually don't know the Davieses. So Alan Purdon is remembered in this little Clumber church. But we've got a problem with Roland. He is missing. What do? You just hold on and you hold on and you hope and you hope, rather like with Clive House yesterday. And then, as you can see, here comes a note to say that, and here it says, a statement of particulars to be forwarded to the War Office, and what it says is that Rowland Hill is now deemed to be dead. Okay? He is now thought to be dead, and this is a year later. It is 1918, and so his family is now going to have a memorial service at Southwell. And at Southwell Church, which is where the memorial was held, That is where his photograph is, and here is a rather grand plaque to Joe Patterson, the son of the rector, Vic Patterson, the son of the rector, David Lisher, the son of a poor labourer, Stephen Arthur Haytendale, who inherited vast farms and who was an engineer, Roy Hill, who is to die next year, but he comes home after Passchendaele with what I think is the nervous breakdown, and Rowland Hill. And in Southwell, after the Second World War, they erected this rather nice window, but tucked away inside the window is this little 1914-18, and this is actually Roy Hill, because he was more on this side. Okay, he's remembered here. Now, just to go back to our Battle of Flanders, this is what it looks like today when I do my walk. From here, and I'll just have to quickly try and remember, from here I'm looking over towards Ypres. From here, looking back towards Ypres. Over here, actually, is now where those brickworks are and the Bremen Redoubt. But it's lovely grassland, and obviously I'm here at all different times of the year. This was obviously the millie time. It's very stinky, the potatoes, I must tell you. The millies are not so stinky. And I just boldly trespass onwards. They don't do shooting here. When I am in France, I wear a yellow car guard top. And my stepdaughter said this time, she said there's going to be a headline in the Sunday Times, South African car guard shot by hunters in French wood. Because I actually am a great trespasser. Woods are wonderful to go hunting for battles in. But this is what it looks like. It looks peaceful, as though nothing has ever happened. And then there's a bit of an old pillbox. And it just reminds you. This would be the German side of the pillbox. And then you see that the farmer in his ploughing has brought up a whole lot of bits and pieces. Now, he won't bother to bring up the bits and pieces that are safe, although actually he's brought up bits of metal. But these are very dangerous. They are unexploded shells, and people's first inclination is to rush up and be incredibly excited. And the answer is go as far away as you can. I actually find all sorts of things. I'm forever looking. Firstly, I'm looking for a body, and then I'm looking for badges. Mainly, I find things like spades. And what I have tomorrow that I'm taking to friends of ours, the Handspring Puppet Company, who did the Warhorse puppets, I've got Basil and Adrian a horseshoe from a battlefield. And for various reasons, it is a First World War horseshoe, not a subsequent one. And here we've got some different kinds of pillboxes, okay? And here we've got that South African cemetery I mentioned, except there are hardly any names here. They are mainly unknown soldiers. And from here, you look across the field up to Tyncott. Tyncott was called that by the Northumberland Fusiliers because they thought that the pillboxes looked like cots. And so here is Tyncott. And at Tyncott are buried, and I've got the numbers, 11,000 graves, of which 8,500 are unnamed graves. And because there are so many bodies that are lost, at Tyncott Cemetery alone, along here are just over 35,000 names of those who are missing and who have no body. And here they are again. This is the honeymoon. We went on honeymoon and Leslie wore a yellow raincoat the entire time, a purple umbrella. She said it's the worst time of her life, and she put little flags next to every South African and will not go again. Okay, now the Germans too died, as we know. But the French and the Belgians did not want to give them lovely land for lovely cemeteries. So they have mass graves. And this is the grave at Vladslo, which is where a lot of German soldiers who were in the Ypres campaign were buried. 10 names to every stone, every now and then a cross. And here are Katie Colvitz's statues of the grieving parents. She is one of the parents because her son, Peter Kolwitz, was a student in 1914 when he was killed. In Ypres itself, a church was erected in memory of this particular campaign. There are many, many plaques, and there is a springback kneeler. And here is the Menin Gate, the Moat. And in 1927, a memorial was erected at the old Menin Gate that I showed you. At the top of the Menin Gate, and this is from the outside, is the lion. And it says, "To the armies of the British Empire who stood here from 1914 to 1918, and to those of their dead who have no